The iX is the first BMW ever to not have a number in its name. Why is that? Well, it's kind of because this is a showcase of where the brand's electric technology is. And in today's video, we're going to be checking this big electric SUV out. Now, like the i3 city car, the BMW iX sits out of sorts with the range. That little electric vehicle wasn't a 3 Series replacement, it was tiny. The iX doesn't have a number, so where does it sit in BMW's range? Well, for a start, it doesn't sit on the usual cluster architecture that the Bavarian brand chooses to use for pretty much all the vehicles on sale right now, apart from the 1 Series. So unlike the iX3 and the i4, which are sort of converted petrol cars into electric vehicles, this thing sits on bespoke underpinnings with exotic materials like aluminium and carbon fiber, which we'll see a bit of in a minute. It's about the same size as a BMW X5 as well, so really it's a large SUV. It sits on a 25mm longer wheelbase though at 3 meters long. So it's kind of a vehicle that's a good size for a family. It's a little bit bigger as well than competitors from Mercedes-Benz, including the EQC and Audi's E-tron. So what exactly is it like to drive and live with? Well, that's what we're going to be finding out in today's video when we test the interior and all the cool functions of this BMW iX. Now, this car behind me is a little bit different to the one that you guys checked out with Nathan Ponchard in the static walk around we did a couple of months back, because this car is the flagship for the moment, that is until the iX M60 arrives. It's the flagship xDrive 50 Sport. It costs $169,700 before on-road costs here in Australia, which is pretty steep, and this car's got a couple of options, which brings that total to $172,400. But what do you get for that? You get a 105.1 kilowatt hour usable lithium-ion battery pack, a pair of electric motors that contribute to a 385 kilowatt total power figure and all-wheel drive, and a 4.6 second 0 to 100k an hour time. So it's a pretty serious SUV, quicker than, actually exactly the same speed as a first generation BMW M2 with a manual gearbox, another 4.6 second 0 to 100k an hour car. But of course, it's completely different. So let's get under the skin of this iX and find out what it's like to sit inside of, live with, and drive. And of course, if you have any questions or opinions on the BMW iX, let me know in the comments section down below. And if you haven't done so already, we'd also love it if you could hit subscribe to Chasing Cars. So first up, how the iX looks. And this is all subjective, of course, but this is a vehicle that showcases BMW's new monolithic design language, and I think it does that quite well. It's big and it's brash, and you've got stuff like these really cool kidney grills that house all of the stuff for the adaptive cruise control and the highway driving assist that we'll talk about a little bit later. They're also semi-self-healing, a bit like Deadpool, so if you get a rock strike or something, it'll seal itself back up. You've got these lovely aggressive slitty laser lights here that look really crisp and sharp on this vehicle, and maybe they do sit a bit out of sorts with the slightly bulbous rest of the design language, but yeah, I think it's working for me more in real life than it did in pictures, that's for sure. And then finally, this little cool touch around the front, the BMW emblem pops up so you can top up your washer fluid because the bonnet doesn't open. So down the sides, we've got these massive 22-inch alloy wheels, or at least they would be massive if the iX wasn't so huge, because they've got 275 40 series tires on them, which actually have heaps of sidewall, and it really just puts into perspective how big this BMW SUV is. And then to complement those sharp front-end laser lights, we've got these lovely slitty LED rear taillights here, which I think actually look really good. xDrive 50 badging as well. I'll add that this car has a fully flat underfloor, which helps contribute to its pretty decent 0.25 coefficient of drag. And yeah, look, in the flesh, this car looks a whole heap better than I thought it was going to look in photos, and I'm actually kind of glad that it has a bit of brutalist chic sort of thing going on, because yeah, I was a little bit worried, but of course it's all personal opinion design, so let me know yours in the comment section down below. And of course, if you've already seen enough of this BMW iX xDrive 50, then I've dropped a link below this video which can take you to organize a test drive, download a brochure, or read our written review on the Chasing Cars site if you wish. So around the rear of the iX, we've got this really broad set of hips here that you would expect to give you a massive boot. But at 500 litres, it's sort of about right for this kind of class, if a little short. So the reason for that is these chunky sort of sills, I guess you'd call them, made out of carbon fiber here. That sort of tells you what this car's about a little bit. You've also got these cool tail lights here, which actually glow through into the little slits that I showed you before and give it this really nice diffused look. Anyway, we've got 500 litres of space, as I mentioned, and the boot is really nicely finished. You've got electrical folding second row as well, so if you need to put bigger items like bicycles or flat pack furniture in, it's super easy to do. You don't have to put your back out by leaning in and reaching in there. Yeah, as I said, carpet's really lovely. You've got a little rubberized net off to the side there, and then under this boot floor, we've also got space for charging cables and unfortunately no spare tire, but you do have a little inflatable kit, and you've got a net to keep the family Labrador from getting into the back seat. So yeah, altogether a pretty decent boot. Nothing super special to write home about, but you do get to see a little bit of carbon fiber, which is always fun. So there's an awful lot to talk about in the cabin of the BMW iX, and I know Ponch has given a pretty decent overview of this car in a previous video, but having lived with it for a good couple of hours so far, I think I have a little bit more of an insight and a little bit more to tell you about all the things that BMW has rolled out in this car. But before we get to the technology package and all the snazzy stuff going on, I want to talk a little bit about the materials that have been used in this car, because I really kind of nerd out on this sustainable material thing that's going on. So in the construction of this vehicle, BMW uses a lot of recycled aluminium and plastic where it can, and then there's also stuff like these floor mats, which are made from recycled fishnets. Now, it's not the only company to have that going on, but it is a nice little touch that makes the process of building new cars a little bit less strenuous on the environment. And also stuff like tanning the leather seats with olive extract rather than chemicals must make a benefit. Now on that, these leather seats are actually really comfortable. This is the Amido colorway. You can also get cloth as a no-cost option, or you can get a snazzier terracotta color, and I think that would look really great with the grey exterior of this car. I think it would give it a nice visual lift and give it a good little bit of a spec difference. Now on these seats, they're fully electrically adjustable. Up here on the door cards, like a Mercedes Benz, I haven't seen this before in a BMW, at least to my knowledge, 2-position memory for the driver and the passenger, so no second-class citizens here. But only heating is standard on this BMW iX xDrive 50. You have to pay more money in an options pack to get active seat ventilation. And at $170,000, I wish that active seat ventilation was thrown in for standard, because in a hot country like Australia, that's going to lower the drain on the battery and just make your life a little bit more comfortable. Not to say the leather seats don't breathe, but it would just make it better. Now, let's move into the technology package, because those heated seats are all activated through the climate menu, which is found on this 14.9-inch touchscreen, which is pretty huge. It's really wide, and it's a real move away from what you see in most of the cluster architecture-based BMWs. It's definitely sharper and has this visual lightness aided by the fact that it is separated from the dashboard a little bit. I really like that effect. You see light spilling down around it, and I think that's quite cool. As for how well it works, well, you get your head around it, and it's a very responsive touchscreen, and it looks really crisp. And you can still run wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto on this vehicle as well. So you can use Waze or Google Maps to get yourself around. But it does have live traffic with free subscriptions for a good couple of years. Look, I find myself not quite totally au fait with using this touchscreen interface yet. There's still a little bit of complexity going on. I've still got to wrap my head around it a little bit more, but I think after a week or so of really driving this car and learning it and getting used to it, I think it would all fall into place a little bit better. Now, I should add that you do have the usual shortcut buttons to get you around, which really helps. Set into this lovely little teak flourish, which is an option, the clear and bold package, and I love this teak. I think this is gorgeous. It feels like a used parker table. It's got a really nice feeling to it, and it just adds a little bit of extra lift to this cabin, though I would love to see more of it in place of this rose gold. But anyway, back to the technology. Yeah, it works well. You have other ways of interacting as well. So we've got gesture controls for turning up and down the volume. You've got the personal assistant. You can do stuff like drop the windows, turn on and off lane departure warning and all that sort of stuff. It's really good, and it makes interacting with this car a little bit easier. Now, the 12.3-inch driver's display in front of me has also come a long way from previous BMWs, because you can adjust stuff like the content, layout, and the heads-up display using the buttons on the steering wheel, which is really nice. And the navigation screen does look a little bit crisper. It's got a bit more pizzazz to it than the cars with the previous digital driver's display. So obviously BMW is starting to listen to us. On that subject, the hexagonal wheel. Now it's an interesting one, it feels a little bit Austin Allegro, as Ponch pointed out. It does have an electrically adjustable steering column, which is nice, and it gives you a sort of comfort access mode. But yeah, it's a bit weird to hold. I reckon BMW were toying around with cutting the top off, maybe like a Tesla thing. It feels like the top part is a sort of afterthought. It was going to be like a video game style trigger, but yeah, we've gone back to hexagonal, and in use, you get used to it. It looks snazzy, 2 spokes, give it that extra visual lightness that feeds into the rest of this interior, because you do have an awful lot of space, and it's all about making this car feel a little bit more like a lounge room, so you can relax when you're out on a long road trip. You've got all this open space here, it lets light in and it doesn't feel dark and dingy. You've also got that fully panoramic glass roof, which doesn't open, but you can fully cut out all UV rays if you want at the press of a button, or have it open when it's a little bit cooler, and yeah, it works really nicely. Finally, onto the practicalities of this car. You've got a good deep center bin under here, great for storing water bottles, sort of handbags and that sort of thing. You've got this really interesting little spot to hold a smartphone, so a passenger can have their little smartphone there and watch for any alerts or text messages that might come through. 2 cup holders down here, a wireless charging pad, and you've also got really nice, generous door pockets that you can fit a 1.5 litre water bottle in. Finally, the stereo. This car's got an 18-speaker Harman Kardon unit, which sounds actually really good. I think the car is well set up to be a bit of an audiophile's paradise. And on that subject, you can also option, if you wish, a 30-speaker 1,650 watt Bowers & Wilkins system if you really want to maximize your sound experience. Now, I usually loathe sitting in back seats of cars. Even stuff like the Toyota Land Cruiser Prado doesn't really have enough space for me to sit in the back of really comfortably. That's where the iX differs, because it feels like BMW has really engineered this thing to have 5 people. I've got plenty of space across this bench. There's no transmission tunnel, unlike a rear-wheel drive vehicle, because the electric motors are mounted one at each axle and they don't really have to talk to each other physically. It's all done electrically. So that means you've got heaps of space for the middle seat. And the actual chairs themselves are so lovely. You really sink into the bottom cushion, nicely inclined as well. Not huge amounts of under thigh support, but I think most people who are shorter than me are not going to have any issues there with that at all. And I will add that they have this really nice extra touch of being almost little mirrors of the front Tombstone seats. I think it's a really classy touch. Speaking of those Tombstone seats, you can see straight through from this side of the seat to the BMW logo. It's almost like a subliminal message that although this is a BMW, this is a vehicle that is pushing into the future. Now, adding to the general comfort back here are a couple of really clever touches, like this little tablet holder that you can get from BMW as an accessory that has a great proximity to the 2 USB-C fast charge ports on the back of the seat. I think it's a really nice little engineering touch that's clearly been thought about in depth by BMW. We've also got a separate set of vents back here with a climate control setting for both of the outboard passengers, so you can have different temperatures, which is a really nice touch. Vents down there in the floor, up here that are adjustable, and another set up here for both passengers, so you really do get that full cooling experience. As for some other things, of course, we've got soft touch materials back here, and you've also got really nice practicalities like the ability to carry a 1.5 litre bottle easily in the door cards, if not bigger. This flip down armrest too, with 2 deployable cup holders that you can pop back. And yeah, the back seat of the BMW iX is perhaps the best place to be in the entire car, at least in my book. Actually, I forgot to mention, the one thing I don't love about the iX's back seat is that the windows only go this far down, which is kind of annoying. Servicing a BMW iX for 6 years or unlimited kilometers, if you buy a service plan from BMW, is going to cost you $2,196 for basic cover. However, if you want to opt for going for the more involved Plus package, where you get brake rotor and wiper blade replacements, it's going to cost you over $6,000, which seems really steep considering the fact that this car's regen braking is actually strong enough that you almost don't need to touch the brake pedal most of the time. So I'd probably just go for the basic package if it was my choice, but you know, horses for courses. Now, the warranty is a little bit lacking behind some of its rivals. So it's a 3-year unlimited kilometer guarantee in Australia for most of the parts of this vehicle, but it does have the industry standard 8-year, 160,000 kilometer battery warranty that we've come to expect. So what about charging the BMW iX? Well, For a start, BMW includes 5 years of free charging using the ChargeFox network here in Australia, which is a nice touch. Now for that 105.1 kilowatt hour usable or 111.5 kilowatt hour gross lithium ion battery pack, it's going to take about 35 minutes to charge from 10 to 80% if you can find a DC fast charger that can give you up to 200 kilowatts, because that's this car's limited speed. Now for AC charging, it's capped at 11 kilowatts. So for home two-phase electronics where you'll be charging in your garage or something like that, it'll probably take about overnight to give you a full battery charge for this thing. Now that does have a couple of drawbacks compared to some competitors from other brands. For example, the J1 platform-based Porsche Taycan and Audi E-tron, both of which have 800 volt electrical systems which allow faster DC charging at up to 270 kilowatts, so you can juice it a little bit faster than this car. But hey, horses for courses, at least you get some free charging thrown in with this. That's a great thing in my opinion. So the BMW iX, this is a pretty funky electric SUV. As I said in the start, this is the first BMW ever to eschew numbers from its naming convention. Instead, it's just iX, that's all it is. And yeah, it's really interesting because obviously, as we went over in the interior, you're sort of bewildered by the technology levels in this vehicle. And I was a little bit skeptical in how they'd all come together to make a car that felt holistic and also felt like a BMW. But I think that, yeah, it's actually struck a really interesting level of completeness. It feels quite well refined, this package, and it's obviously very different to, I guess, what you'd call one of its main rivals, the Tesla Model X. It doesn't have quite the showmanship of that vehicle, but it's got this sort of quiet confidence about the way it does its thing that it's quite, yeah, quite nice, this car. I really like it. Let's talk about the drivetrain first up. So this is the mid-spec model. It's currently the range topper in Australia. It's got 385 kilowatts of power and 765 newton meters of torque from a pair of electric motors. I'll flash each motor's exact outputs up on the screen right now, but effectively when they're working in tandem, they're their peak outputs. And you don't need to go into any boost modes or anything like that. That's sort of available anytime when you're in sport mode, as long as the battery has enough charge in it. And that means it's pretty quick at getting to 100 k's an hour. 4.6 seconds is the official claim. Though of course, with the electric nature of this car, what's really impressive is the way it hits when you go full throttle, which I'm about to do now, which always surprises you. And that's always the first thing you do when someone gets in the car with you in the iX. You got to feel how that is, because it just cannot be matched by any combustion car unless you're sort of locked in first gear. And if you're locked in first gear in a really powerful car, you're more likely to get wheel spin. So yeah, it's such a unique experience, this vehicle, and it, you know, it'll tickle some taste buds for sure. Now there is a more powerful vehicle coming as well, the M60, which is going to have 455 kilowatts of power and 1,100 newton meters of torque. Now those outputs are frankly pretty astounding when you read them written on paper, and whether it needs more grunt, I don't know. But as we'll get to in a minute, this car actually has a really good chassis to back up all of that grunt. But before we get there, I just want to talk a little bit about the cool adaptive safety features that this vehicle has. Now, it does have a 5-star ANCAP rating as of 2021 in November, though it did lose a little bit for safety assistance points. But what I'm about to demonstrate now as we're rolling through a beautiful Victorian country town is the adaptive brake regeneration. Now, I'm not touching the pedals. The car itself is regenning based on information it has in front of him. It can see a vehicle in front, we're rolling through a town, and it's just applied some of the adaptive regen braking to slow me down. Now that's obviously helping feed back into the range. We've got 60% of battery remaining and 292 kilometers of range. Now obviously we're not hitting targets today because we're, range targets I should say, because really we're running up and down, doing driving shots, leaving the car idling for long periods of time. But look at it go, slowing me right down. It really does rely on regen braking, this car. And I should add, the adaptive system is supposed to work on stuff like when you're coming up to a junction. It's supposed to know where you've got a potential red light ahead of you and that sort of thing. I haven't found it to work in that sense that well, but when you do on a one-pedal drive, you can knock the shifter back into B mode, and the adaptive regen braking applies sort of, I'd say about 40% of maximum brake force. Maybe not 40%, probably about 30%. And you can drive this car like that around town. It's quite rewarding and obviously feeds back into getting more kilometers out of your tank of electrons. Now, let's talk a little bit about the handling of this vehicle, because one thing I was a little bit worried about is that This thing weighs 2,520 kilograms. That is a lot of kilograms. That's sort of what a Toyota Land Cruiser Prado or something like a Nissan Patrol V8 weigh. Now, I've driven both of those cars and I can tell you they do not feel really light on their feet. They feel pretty leaden and, you know, safe and predictable, but this car has a whole lot more talent than those vehicles, as you'd expect, because it is, you know, sort of double the price of both of those cars. But even considering that level of expense, the iX is really impressive. And it's not only impressive just because the adaptive air suspension curtails roll in the bends and manages to keep it feeling really flat. You've also got this four-wheel steer system that works with the front wheels at lower speeds to get this vehicle feeling more pointy, a little bit sharper on the steering. But it all just comes together. It's not like the technology feels out of sorts with each other. I've been really impressed with how the iX feels like a holistic package out on the road and how it feels like a BMW when you start to push it. The grip's there. It's obviously not going to trouble something like an M5 sedan or even really maybe an M5 competition. It definitely just doesn't have quite that level of corner polish, but it does step up to the game when you need it to. That is the proviso that you have it in sport mode. Pretty easy to do. Pop my modes and you go sport. You can adjust settings in sport mode. As default, you're in personal. We'll go back to personal now, and that works really nicely. And the great thing about this car is, despite the massive 22-inch alloy wheels, is that it rides really well. It's got a very flat feeling to it over bumps, and in comfort you can get a little bit jostled around at higher speeds as the body moves on the air suspension, but actually knocking it into sport mode means that happens a little bit less when you're up at higher speeds. And I should add that sport mode sounds super cool as well. We've got these Hans Zimmer sounds, and on this sort of BMW Blitz week that I've been doing, driving a whole load of vehicles from the brand down in Melbourne, away from the usual office in Sydney, but on roads I'm familiar with, it's got this really cool note. It sort of sounds almost like the B58 engine, like there's sort of overrun programmed into it, and it works really nicely, and it gives a different vibe to this car from other vehicles. And I think as we push more into electrification, it's going to become really important for manufacturers to eke out what it means to be that brand. And obviously BMW, Audi and Mercedes are all thinking about that proactively, and BMW's way of doing that is with this sound. And I'm going to do it one more time because I quite like it. Yeah, I like the Hans Zimmer sounds. It's cool. You even get it when you're sort of regenning. It's cool. So yeah, that's the BMW iX. It's an interesting vehicle to drive, not outright the most dynamic thing in the world, but then it's not supposed to be. But as a comfortable electric SUV that you can waft along in silence and in total comfort, and then have this absurd turn of speed, and then a surprising amount of dynamicism in the corners, I gotta say, the iX is an impressive and intriguing package, and I look forward to seeing what BMW does with these bespoke underpinnings into the future. So we already knew that the BMW iX had a really impressive tech package after Nathan Ponchard's detailed preview walk around of this vehicle. But experiencing it out in the real world, where you've got other driving and other things to take care of while you're operating the iX, it's amazing how well it all falls into place, and it feels pretty natural. The voice command is still learning, but I think as it learns your voice, it's going to get better and better. Most importantly though, this iX xDrive 50 can really step up when you need it to take on a testing set of corners. Its composure when in sport mode is really impressive, and it does all of that without sacrificing ride quality, thanks to that really fantastic adaptive air suspension system. Of course, there's absolutely prodigious levels of power and torque, which are only going to get better when we get the M60 that's slated for Australia sometime shortly in the future, which has 1100 Newton meters of torque, which is going to blow this thing away from a set of traffic lights. But that's kind of not what the iX xDrive 50 is all about. It's just a really impressive EV that really took me by surprise, actually. And if you're willing to live with the extra complication of charging an electric vehicle, which is getting easier as we go and more charge points open up in Australia, then I think you should really consider this if you're looking at something like a BMW X5M or a Cayenne GTS, because as an electric vehicle, this is accomplished, but also as a sporting SUV, it's also a very accomplished vehicle. Now let me know your thoughts on the BMW iX down below. While you're down there leaving your opinion, we'd also love it if you could hit subscribe if you haven't done so already. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.